I'm Thomas Smith. I'm a technology journalist and the CEO of Gatto Images, and I also have worked in AI for over a decade. And this is Tom Talks Tech, a new podcast where I'll share perspectives on everything in technology and the technology world, from cooking to crypto. Join me here as I explore the world of technology on Tom Talks Tech. I'm Tom in my car again today, talking about the sad demise of Fry's Electronics, which was announced on Tuesday night. And I wrote a kind of a history and a eulogy of sorts for Fry's that was published this morning in Debugger on Medium. It's debugger.medium.com. And if you're not from the Bay Area or you haven't spent time in Silicon Valley, you might not know about Fry's. It's a electronics superstore, kind of like a Micro Center on the East Coast, like a giant Radio Shack in some ways, kind of like a Best Buy, but as I'll explain, very, very different in a lot of ways. And it was one of the iconic kind of legacy brands in the Valley. As I said in the piece, the relationship of Silicon Valley to Fry's, I think, was partially nostalgic and partially very practical, because it was a place where people still got a lot of electronics and hardware. And the company announced on Tuesday night, very abruptly, there wasn't really any warning, that they were going to close all 31 of their stores and shut down, wind down the company. So let's take a look back at Fry's firstly. It was founded originally in 1985, and people might think, well, that's the name of a supermarket. There's still an existing supermarket called Fry's, and it's not at all affiliated anymore with Fry's Electronics. It's actually part of the Kroger supermarket chain. But there was a tie-in, and that's that the founder of the Fry's supermarkets, when he sold that chain, I believe it was in 1972, he gave his three sons the proceeds, some of the proceeds from that sale, which I think was about $14 million at the time. And his sons didn't really have any interest in going into the grocery business, but they were very interested in electronics and the world of computers that was starting to evolve. So in 1985, they took their proceeds from the sale of their father's supermarket chain, as well as their knowledge of the supermarket industry, and applied it to the world of electronics. And they launched the first Fry's store in the Silicon Valley in 1985. And from the very beginning, Fry's took this model of the grocery store and applied that to selling electronics and parts. And if you know anything about the grocery business, it's a very strange business in a lot of ways, in that it's really super high revenue. So the average individual grocery store, not a grocery chain, but each store that you might have in your own neighborhood, like a Safeway or an Acme or anything like that, brings in about $14 million per year in gross revenue. So think about that. I mean, that's more than a lot of small companies bring in. And that's one grocery store on average across the country brings in $14 million. But the margins are really slim. It's usually around a 2.5% margin. So the amount that they actually make on that $14 million of revenue is very, very tiny. And grocery stores, though, because they sell so much product, even if their margins are very bad or very low, they still make a lot of money. It's a very profitable business, but one with these very, very, very slim margins. And so the supermarket model is, buy up a huge space, fill it with tons of products, tons of different products, sell a huge amount of that product, and collect this tiny, tiny margin. And that worked really well in the supermarket industry. And the Fry brothers' innovation was to take that same model and apply it to electronics. So when they launched their first store, the first one they launched was 20,000 square feet, which is a huge retail space for a brand new retailer. And as the company got more established, their later stores were as big as 180,000 square feet, which is just massive, sprawling space. Much bigger than your typical Best Buy, probably on the scale of a Costco or something along those lines. And that allowed them to sell up to 50,000 individual products in a Fry's store. So that's, again, a huge selection. And from the very beginning, it was all manner of things. It was these kind of finished consumer products like computers and calculators and that kind of thing in the beginning, but also a wide range of computer peripherals and components and even individual electronic components that people could use to create these sort of professional products or for engineers to use in their work. And that comprehensiveness and just massive, massive scale worked really well for the Fry brothers in the very beginning. So through the 80s and 90s, even into the 2000s, Fry's expanded. And again, it reached 31 stores at its pinnacle. And it spanned basically the West Coast. There were some stores in Texas, but the vast majority were in California. And then they worked their way into places like Arizona. They were expanding east a bit, but, again, it was mostly a West Coast brand. And within the Valley, Fry's had several different locations and really an audience or a following, I would say, of engineers who really loved the fact that they could go to a Fry's and walk around and browse and find everything that they needed from, sundries and random items. And at the end, they were selling perfume, cologne, cooking equipment, to resistors and transistors and the very basic components that you would need to build your own computer or build your own electronics or do prototyping and that kind of thing. So they always had this really weird sort of broad set of different items that they sold, again facilitated by this gigantic scale. And they borrowed some other things from their grocery background too. They had very sort of strange and eclectic location-specific themes for each of the stores. So one of them had a tiki theme where it was had its own tiki bar kind of area and rainforest. There was one that celebrated the legacy of California's railroads that had a full-size train inside of the store. And the one that I would go to most frequently, which is in Fremont, California, right at sort of the start of the Silicon Valley area, had an 1883 World's Fair theme. So it was like Victorian theme with electricity and almost like a steampunk type of feel to it. And again, think about, a Trader Joe's that customizes the inside of their store to a particular location and has imagery and things that reflect that location. It's a very grocery store thing to do, and Fry's also applied that to the world of electronics, which kind of gave each store its own personality. And of course, it's sort of a gimmick. People would come to the stores to see the train or to see, this particular kind of theming. So a lot of this grocery legacy and grocery business model applied to this high-end electronics, and also they really catered to a very technical audience from the very beginning. So a lot of Silicon Valley engineers would remember wandering around Fry's and buying these kinds of very kind of tech-oriented, pro-tech-oriented products that you couldn't find anywhere else, or you couldn't easily find anywhere else. And that persisted really until the end. That was still the case that you could get pretty much any tech product at Fry's through the end of when they just shut down. I originally went there right after I moved to the Silicon Valley area in 2013. I think I visited Fry's in 2014. And it was a similar type of thing. I was living up in Walnut Creek. I needed a piece of VoIP hardware, and I couldn't find it anywhere else in the Bay Area. I needed it pretty rapidly. And of course, Fry's had it. So I drove down and bought it. And that was the start of many times that I went down there when I couldn't find a product somewhere else, and it was worth driving, an hour and a half round trip to pick up a particular item. And it always had a weird vibe. It was like warehouse space, weird theming, never a ton of people in it, but everybody seemed very technical, kind of dim lighting, and just had this very particular vibe. But it was always nice to know that anything I needed, if I couldn't get it on Amazon, or I didn't want to wait for it to be shipped from DigiKey or another store like that, I could always go to Fry's and find it. And the last time that I went to Fry's was actually in October of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and my air conditioner died, and I needed to have some kind of a portable air conditioner. And I ordered one on Amazon, a Black & Decker model that was maybe $300, but it took about a week to get there, and I knew it was going to take a long time. So I drove down to Fry's, and sure enough, they had a $500 air conditioner from a random Italian brand called Dolce Clima that was designed to cool server rooms. But it was there, and I could buy it, and it worked great. Actually, it's a great portable air conditioner, and that's sort of, where Fry's comes in. They've always got what you need, or they always had what you need. But, probably around the early 2000s, there started to be some challenges. And the biggest one, I think, is that kind of ironically for a company that's so high-tech or was in the high-tech world, they really never embraced e-commerce. So I think they only launched their websites in 2006 versus some of their competition like Best Buy had a website and was selling products online as early as 1998. So they were almost a decade late to the e-commerce world and just never really embraced that, never put the resources behind it. And, even when I looked at their website probably a year ago to try to find something, it's very clunky, it was hard to navigate. It was a challenge to see what was in stock. I just think they never really put the resources into that. And of course, that was a huge problem because some of the other brands like Best Buy have managed to survive in the retail space by, having a strong e-commerce presence in addition to their physical stores. And Fry's just never really embraced that, and I think they were way too late to that. And they tried. I think they tried, at a later point to be more innovative. They partnered with a company to do same-day delivery in 2017, which was very appreciated in the Valley. If you're working on a project and you need a particular part immediately, you don't necessarily want to leave your company's headquarters to get it. So people knew you could order it from Fry's, and within 4 hours, you'd get it delivered to your door. So that was definitely valued, but I think they were just too late. It was too little, too late for the chain. And it's a family-owned company. It's a privately held company. So there's not an ability to see, their revenue or to look at how that was changing over time. But observers and insiders and journalists started to worry about Fry's, I'd say around 2018, 2019, when it was just clear that they really hadn't kept up with the e-commerce world. Amazon was ascending, and so there were starting to appear to be kind of cracks in this business model of buy these huge spaces, have this warehouse-type presence, and really don't embrace the internet. And then I think, COVID happened. They were probably on thin ice leading up to that, and a couple things happened around COVID. Obviously, there was the pandemic itself, which has really changed retail. E-commerce has surged. Physical retail has struggled. There were times when physical retail in California was totally shut down, and they tried to adapt to that. When I visited in October of 2020, there were, infrared thermometers and face masks and other COVID stuff that they were really pushing at Fry's, and they had a much better selection of that kind of stuff than a lot of other places did. But really retail in general got impacted very dramatically. And the other piece to it was that all of the tariffs that were imposed on China, where they got a lot of their goods, especially the sort of low-end stuff that they probably had in bulk, that apparently became a lot more expensive. And so when you're dealing with a situation where you're embracing these super thin margins like you would for a supermarket business, then any change like that can be a huge negative impact to your profitability. And that probably was another driver of Fry's ultimate demise. And so those factors combined, COVID, I think not really embracing e-commerce, and then changing landscape in terms of tariffs and the cost of their products, ultimately it sounds like was just too much for them to weather. And they announced on Tuesday again that they are closing permanently and winding down all 31 of their stores. So I think that's a sad moment for the Valley. This, even though a lot of people maybe weren't going to it all the time, I think a lot of people in the Valley valued knowing that Fry's was there. A lot of people probably remember browsing through there in the 80s and 90s, and it's, I think, emblematic of this earlier time in the Valley when you could have 50,000 or 100,000 square foot space, and it wasn't so murderously expensive to have that scale of floor plan and that scale of retail, and also just this informal kind of feeling of the early days of the homebrew computer club, and then leading into this sort of kitschy Valley culture of like we see at the Fremont store I would go to, and these weird displays, and it's just sort of an informal engineering focused type of an environment that I think people really feel nostalgic for. So I think there's a lot of sadness in the Valley around this closure, much more so than I think people felt when, Circuit City or something shut down. Maybe akin to Radio Shack in some ways, because I think that's another bankruptcy or failure that hit home for a lot of people. But yeah, I think there's a feeling of sadness about this closure. There's a feeling that you always knew Fry's was there. If you really needed something, you could always drive there. You could order something and have it delivered to you same day. And yeah, just that nostalgic element of the stores. So I think it's something that is emblematic of Valley culture in a lot of ways. It's an older slice of Valley culture, and there's probably a realization with the closure that a lot of that culture has been fading for a while, and a lot of it will probably ultimately totally fade away. So that's the sad element of Fry's closure. We don't know yet what exactly will happen to the brand. It's possible that somebody will resurrect it in some other form. We've seen legacy brands like Polaroid, for example, that shut down operations and then ended up selling their brand names and some of their technologies to other people. So it's possible we'll see that, kind of resurrected. And they have committed, though, there's a statement on their website, frys.com, where they're committing to a kind of orderly wind down and making this as painless as possible for stakeholders and creditors and their employees of these stores. So if you want to read more about Fry's and see some of the photos that I've taken there as part of my series, Visualizing the Valley, you can go to debugger.medium.com, read my whole story about Fry's. Subscribe to me here. Follow me if you want to hear more of these podcast episodes. You can also follow me on Medium to see my articles there. If you want to read more about my thoughts on Silicon Valley in general, check out the piece I'll Never Leave Silicon Valley, which is published on 10.medium.com. Sad day to see Fry's leave, but it's also nice to connect with that history and that slice of the Valley. So join me, read my story, debugger.medium.com, and we'll explore it together.